In a city where vigilance blends with prejudice, a single moment changes everything. Samuel Carter, a respected man, faces an unexpected confrontation from Officer Dennis Caldwell, whose assumptions set off a chain reaction with profound consequences. Why did an ordinary day turn into a tense arrest? What truths will emerge as Samuel Carter's true identity gradually comes to light? What challenges will Dennis face next as the fallout deepens? Join us as we delve into the tense and dramatic twists of this story, where one encounter forces a reckoning and exposes the hidden biases within us all. But before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story about courage and family love touches your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more powerful stories. Samuel Carter sat on a wooden bench at Crescent Hills Park, the late afternoon sun casting a gentle glow over the vibrant greenery. He turned a page of his well-worn novel, savoring a rare moment of peace. The park, nestled in the heart of the city, was his refuge, a place where he could distance himself from the pressures of his career, if only briefly. The sound of children's laughter echoed nearby, mingling with the rustle of leaves stirred by a light breeze. Samuel allowed himself a small smile, grateful for this slice of tranquility. Meanwhile, Officer Dennis Caldwell patrolled the park, his eyes scanning each detail with the practiced vigilance that came with 2 decades of service. In his view, Crescent Hills had become more unpredictable in recent years, and it was his duty to maintain order. His eyes fell on Samuel, seated alone and seemingly unbothered. A ripple of unease crept up his spine. There had been reports circulating about a man suspected of involvement in recent disturbances, a vague description that vaguely matched Samuel. Tall, middle-aged, dark-skinned. Dennis narrowed his gaze. Too calm, he thought, his hand instinctively resting on his baton. He had walked this park 1,000 times. Yet something about Samuel's composed manner made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. "Haven't seen him around before," he muttered, eyes narrowing as he took a step forward. Samuel sensed the scrutiny before he saw it. Years of dealing with moments like this had sharpened his instincts. He glanced up and locked eyes with Dennis, his face impassive. The officer's posture was rigid, his expression veiled yet piercing. Samuel recognized the look, suspicion masked as concern. He let out a quiet sigh, closing his book slowly and marking the page with a practiced motion. He'd been through this before, an encounter that could shift from tense to volatile in seconds. Dennis's footsteps echoed across the path as he approached, each one imbued with silent authority. He squared his shoulders, his fingers tightening around the baton, trying to conceal the growing agitation within him. The way Samuel looked at him, steady and unyielding, was unnerving. It was as though the man held some invisible shield that Dennis couldn't penetrate. "Afternoon," Dennis greeted, his tone flat, a touch too sharp. "Good afternoon," Samuel responded, his voice calm, almost disarming. He kept his hands resting on the closed book in his lap, every movement deliberate. The air between them thickened, coiled tight with the unspoken. "What brings you out here today?" Dennis's question was casual in form, but accusatory in tone. His eyes darted from Samuel's face to the book and back again, searching for any clue, any slip that would justify his unease. Samuel's lips twitched into a half-smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Just enjoying the day," he replied evenly. The answer was simple, true, but Dennis's jaw tightened. "You live around here?" The question had a probing edge now, meant to unsettle. "I've been here and there," Samuel replied, the ambiguity intentional. He could see how the non-answer stoked Dennis's irritation, the slight shift in his stance confirming as much. "Mind showing me some ID?" Dennis's voice hardened, the request more a command than a question. He needed to assert control, to justify the tightening in his chest. Samuel's smile faded, his gaze never wavering. He'd reached the point where these encounters often escalated. He knew his rights. Sitting in a public park required no justification. Yet refusing outright could fan the flames of an already tense situation. His pulse quickened, but his demeanor remained composed. "Am I being detained, officer?" Samuel asked, his voice level, almost too calm for Dennis's liking. The question, so devoid of fear, stung Dennis's pride. "Don't play smart with me," Dennis snapped, his hand moving to his holster. "Show me some ID now." Samuel exhaled, the reality of the moment pressing down on him. He reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness, aware of how a sudden move could be misinterpreted. The silence was charged, eyes from passers-by subtly turning in their direction, the tension palpable. He handed over his ID, his gaze never leaving Dennis's. Dennis snatched it from his grasp, scanning the card without recognition. He knew nothing of the man he was confronting, and that ignorance fed his frustration. "Stand up," he ordered, stepping back with a false sense of readiness. A flicker of frustration crossed Samuel's face, quickly suppressed. He stood, keeping his hands visible, the weight of the moment settling in. "Turn around," Dennis instructed, drawing out a pair of handcuffs. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he complied, feeling the cold metal snap around his wrists. The humiliation stung, the eyes of onlookers boring into him. Yet he remained silent, resolute. As Dennis led him towards the patrol car, Samuel's mind raced, not with fear, but with the heavy weariness of familiarity. He knew who he was. The officer would find out soon enough. But the sting of being reduced to a suspect, despite all he had achieved, bit deeper than the cuffs around his wrists. The engine hummed as they walked, and Samuel's gaze lingered on the park, the sanctuary that had turned into a stage for another painful confrontation. Samuel Carter sat in the back of the patrol car, the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into his wrists, a biting reminder of the reality he found himself in. The car's interior smelled faintly of old leather and disinfectant, sounds of the city muffled as the doors closed. He shifted slightly, his eyes catching his own reflection in the plexiglass divider. A composed man with eyes that betrayed exhaustion, not just from today's events, but from years of encounters like this one. His mind drifted back to when he first decided to pursue a career in law enforcement. He'd grown up believing in justice, in the power of the law to protect and serve. Samuel had worked tirelessly to break barriers, to be seen for his accomplishments rather than judged by the color of his skin. Years of dedication had earned him the respect of many, but moments like these reminded him that for some, he would always just be another suspect. The weight of that realization pressed heavily on his chest, yet he kept his breathing even, his gaze steady on the passing city streets. Up front, Officer Dennis Caldwell gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled tension. The city blurred by, but his mind wasn't on the route. It was on the man sitting silently behind him. Dennis's eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror, catching Samuel's calm, unflinching gaze. The confidence unnerved him, not at the core of his authority. Who was this man really, and why hadn't he shown the fear Dennis was used to seeing in these situations? The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thump of the tires against the road. Dennis tried to reassure himself that he'd done the right thing, that his instincts had never failed him before. Yet, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that this time was different. The brief exchange in the park replayed in his head. Samuel's calm response, the lack of hesitation, the way he had handed over his ID without a tremor. It wasn't defiance. It was something else, something Dennis couldn't quite put a name to. The patrol car slowed at a red light, and Dennis's jaw tightened as he glanced again at Samuel. The man sat there, composed, eyes watching the world outside, as if detached from the current ordeal. It irritated Dennis more than he'd admit, stirring a frustration he couldn't quite shake. He cleared his throat, as if the act would dislodge the unease growing within him. "You gonna tell me what you were really doing in that park?" Dennis's voice cut through the silence, sharper than he intended. Samuel turned his head slightly, meeting Dennis's gaze in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I was reading, officer," Samuel said simply. His tone carried no malice, no sarcasm, only a calm that Dennis found increasingly unnerving. Dennis let out a dry chuckle, though it was devoid of humor. "A guy like you just sitting around reading in a park?" The words slipped out before he could stop them, their implication hanging heavy in the air. Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained silent. The moment stretched, punctuated by the impatient honk of a horn as the light turned green. Dennis pressed the gas, but the nagging doubt didn't abate. The calmness, the confidence, it didn't match the profile of a man who was hiding something. Yet, Dennis's pride fought against that thought, refusing to acknowledge that he might have acted on an assumption, a bias he had never fully confronted. Samuel turned his attention back to the cityscape, allowing his mind to wander. He thought of his colleagues, men and women who had come to respect him not just as an officer, but as a leader. He knew that once they found out who he was, today's events would take on a life of their own. The whispers, the outrage, the silent question of whether this encounter was ever necessary at all. But beneath that, there was another truth that stung more: the quiet, relentless weariness of proving, time and again, that he belonged. The car made a sharp turn, jostling Samuel in his seat. He adjusted himself, the handcuffs rattling against each other. Dennis glanced at the mirror, catching the slight movement and feeling a strange pang of guilt. For the first time in a long while, Dennis felt a crack in the armor of certainty he'd built over 2 decades. What if I'm wrong? The question hit him harder than he expected. The training manual had taught him vigilance, to trust his instincts, but it had never prepared him for this. This doubt, this sinking realization that perhaps his gut was no longer a reliable compass. His pulse quickened as memories of other stops, other faces, surfaced unbidden. Faces he had long since forgotten, but whose stories might not have ended as peacefully as Samuel's could. Samuel's voice broke the silence. "If I may, Officer Caldwell, I understand your position, but trust me when I say, this will not end the way you think." The statement was not a threat, nor a plea. It was simply a truth, spoken as if Samuel already knew the script and was waiting for Dennis to catch up. Dennis felt the words sink into his chest, heavy and undeniable. The rest of the ride passed in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, the weight of realization pressing harder with every mile that carried them closer to the precinct. As they neared their destination, the patrol car slowed, and Dennis's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't ready to admit it, but deep down, the realization had already started to take root. This arrest was a mistake, and the fallout was only just beginning. The patrol car pulled into the station, its tires crunching over gravel as Officer Dennis Caldwell parked near the entrance. The precinct loomed ahead, its stone facade weathered from years of sun and storm, a symbol of authority and order in the heart of the city. Inside, the usual rhythm of the day pulsed. Telephones rang, voices mixed in conversations, and the faint sound of typing added to the hum of activity. Dennis exited the car first, glancing around before opening the back door. Samuel Carter stepped out, his wrists still bound, though his expression remained composed. The eyes of a few officers standing by the entrance followed the scene, brows furrowed with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Samuel noticed their glances, the subtle shift in posture that signaled suspicion, but he kept his gaze forward as Dennis guided him inside. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the tile floors. The moment they entered, a hush fell over the room. Officers paused mid-conversation, their eyes flicking between Dennis and Samuel, absorbing the unexpected sight. Among them was Officer Paul Jenkins, a young but sharp member of the team with a reputation for his attention to detail. He looked up from his station, surprise flashing in his eyes before he schooled his expression. "Caldwell," Jenkins called out, pushing back his chair. "What's going on here?" Dennis's jaw tightened, the unease that had been gnawing at him on the drive over now clawing at his composure. "Caught him acting suspicious at Crescent Hills Park," he said, the statement coming out with less conviction than he intended. He handed Samuel's ID to Jenkins, who took it without comment, his eyes scanning the name and details. Samuel stood still, observing the room. He recognized the subtle shifts in posture, the flickers of doubt and confusion that played across the faces around him. His calm demeanor seemed to unsettle more than reassure. "Samuel Carter?" Jenkins said aloud, a hint of recognition sparking behind his eyes. He glanced up, meeting Samuel's gaze for a fraction of a second before handing the ID back to Dennis. The hesitation wasn't lost on Samuel, who filed it away in his mind. The tension in the room was palpable, and Dennis shifted on his feet. He knew this was the point where the situation would either solidify his judgment or unravel it. His mind raced as Jenkins returned to his desk and entered Samuel's details into the system, fingers tapping keys with practiced precision. Moments later, the door at the far end of the hall opened, and Captain Laura Bridget stepped out, her presence commanding immediate attention. She was in her early 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing and an aura of quiet authority. Her stride was purposeful, her gaze sweeping the room and landing on Dennis and Samuel. "What's this?" Captain Bridget's voice was calm but firm, cutting through the murmurs. Dennis straightened his posture. "Captain, this man was acting suspiciously in the park. He resisted showing his ID initially." Captain Bridget's eyes moved to Samuel, studying him for a long moment. There was a flicker of something in her expression, recognition, perhaps, but she masked it quickly. Samuel met her gaze, unflinching, a subtle acknowledgement passing between them. "Is that so?" she said, her voice neutral but edged with curiosity. She turned to Jenkins. "What have you found, Officer Jenkins?" Jenkins swallowed, glancing at Dennis before responding. "No outstanding warrants, Captain. His ID checks out." Bridget nodded slowly, folding her arms as she turned back to Dennis. "Then why is he cuffed?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dennis felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, their silent judgment pressing in. He matched the description of a suspect from the recent reports. He defended, though even he could hear the thinness in his words. The room seemed to tighten around him, anticipation building as Captain Bridget's eyes narrowed slightly. "Uncuff him," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. The murmur in the room ceased altogether, replaced by a tense silence. Dennis hesitated for a heartbeat, then moved to comply, pulling out his key and unlocking the handcuffs. The cold metal fell away, and Samuel rubbed his wrists, a fleeting look of relief crossing his face. He nodded to Bridget, a silent gesture of thanks that didn't go unnoticed. Captain Bridget's eyes softened for just a moment as she spoke. "Mr. Carter, please follow me to my office. Officer Caldwell, I'll need you to stay put. Jenkins, join us." Dennis's throat tightened, his fingers twitching involuntarily as he watched Samuel walk ahead, flanked by Jenkins. Captain Bridget led the way, her expression unreadable as they moved through the corridor. In her office, the air was different, quieter, more focused. The space was meticulously organized, files and reports lining the shelves in perfect order. Bridget took her seat, motioning for Samuel to do the same. Jenkins stood by the door, his eyes trained on the scene, his face tense with an awareness that something significant was unfolding. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for any misunderstanding," Captain Bridget began, her tone measured but sincere. Samuel's eyes met hers, a faint smile curving his lips. "I understand, Captain. You're just doing your job," Samuel replied, the calm in his voice resonating deeper than any accusation. Captain Bridget exhaled, her gaze shifting to Jenkins, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Whatever was coming next, it was clear that this was only the beginning, and everyone in the room could feel it. The office door clicked shut, and the noise from the precinct's main floor faded to a dull hum. Samuel Carter sat in the chair across from Captain Laura Bridget's expansive desk, the tension in the room taut and coiled. The window behind Bridget framed the bustling street outside, where the city carried on oblivious to the unfolding drama within these walls. Officer Dennis Caldwell stood rigid by the doorway, his jaw clenched and eyes fixed somewhere over Samuel's head. The silence that filled the space was heavy, laden with unspoken questions and the weight of decisions not yet made. Captain Bridget's eyes moved between the two men before settling on Dennis. Her gaze was sharp, as if peeling back the layers of the scene to reveal the truth buried beneath. "Officer Caldwell," she began, her voice cool and steady, "explain to me why Mr. Carter was brought in today." Dennis swallowed, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. He squared his shoulders. "Captain, I observed Mr. Carter acting suspiciously in Crescent Hills Park. He refused to cooperate when I requested his ID, which raised further concerns." Captain Bridget's expression remained neutral, but the subtle tightening around her eyes suggested skepticism. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled together. Suspiciously? Sitting on a bench reading a book is what we're calling suspicious now. The question, though softly spoken, landed like a blow. Dennis's face flushed as he struggled to maintain composure. He fit the description of a suspect we're looking for, Captain, he added, his voice losing a touch of its earlier confidence. And did he resist arrest? Bridget pressed, her eyes narrowing as she searched Dennis's face for any sign of doubt. The room held its breath, the seconds ticking by in an agonizing crawl. Dennis hesitated, glancing at Samuel, who remained impassive, watching the exchange without a word. The silence spoke volumes, and Bridget's brows lifted, a silent invitation for him to answer truthfully. No, Captain, Dennis finally admitted, the words dragging out like a confession. He didn't resist. A flicker of recognition crossed Samuel's face as he locked eyes with Captain Bridget. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she caught it. It was as if they shared an unspoken understanding, one forged from shared experiences on opposite sides of a system both had dedicated their lives to navigating. Bridget shifted her attention back to Samuel, her expression softening only slightly. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice steady, thank you for your patience. I'm aware that this situation must be frustrating. Samuel's lips twitched into a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. It's not the first time, Captain, and unfortunately, I doubt it'll be the last. The room fell silent again, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. Dennis felt the walls closing in, the certainty he'd clung to slipping through his fingers. He glanced at Captain Bridget, trying to read her thoughts, but her face was an unreadable mask. Officer Caldwell, Bridget began, her tone sharpening as she turned back to him. Do you understand the implications of what you did today? Bringing in someone based solely on vague suspicions without concrete evidence undermines trust, not just in you, but in this entire department. Dennis shifted uncomfortably. His eyes dropped to the floor, the reality of his actions beginning to seep in. I was following protocol, Captain, he said weakly, though even he didn't believe it anymore. Protocol doesn't excuse bias, Bridget countered, her voice slicing through the thin veneer of his defense. It's our duty to serve and protect with integrity, not assumptions. Mr. Carter's identity aside, what justifies your approach today? Dennis looked up, eyes pleading for understanding. I thought I was protecting the community. Bridget's gaze softened marginally, a glimmer of understanding tempered with disappointment. Protecting the community means looking beyond assumptions, Officer Caldwell. You acted on a feeling, not evidence. Samuel sat quietly, absorbing the exchange. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a weary acceptance that this conversation was as necessary as it was familiar. He met Bridget's gaze again, acknowledging her silent support with the slightest nod. The captain took a deep breath, breaking the tension with a small exhale. She looked at Samuel with a measured expression. Mr. Carter, I need you to understand that while today was a failure in judgment, it's also an opportunity. For all of us. Samuel's eyes met hers, a flicker of hope sparking behind the fatigue. I hope so, Captain. Change doesn't come easy, but it has to start somewhere. Dennis shifted, the sting of shame coloring his cheeks. The words spoken around him weighed heavily on his conscience. The realization that he'd acted without considering the broader impact of his choices made his chest feel tight. Bridget's eyes turned back to Dennis. Officer Caldwell, you will remain here for further review. This isn't just about discipline. It's about reflection and growth. I expect you to consider what's been discussed. Yes, Captain, Dennis said, his voice barely a whisper. Captain Bridget rose, signaling the end of the conversation. Thank you, Mr. Carter, for your cooperation. I'll make sure this is handled properly. Samuel stood, the tension releasing from his shoulders. He looked at Dennis, his eyes steady but not unkind. We all have lessons to learn, he said, turning to leave. As Samuel walked out of the office, the weight of the confrontation lingered. Captain Bridget watched him go, a silent resolve hardening in her expression. This was only the beginning, and she knew that if real change was to take root, it would take more than words. It would demand action. Captain Laura Bridget watched the door close behind Samuel Carter before shifting her focus back to Officer Dennis Caldwell. The silence that filled her office was sharp, almost tangible. Dennis stood near the doorway, his posture tense, the flush in his cheeks slowly fading to a pale apprehension. He had expected a reprimand, but there was an air of finality in Bridget's expression that made him feel like he was on the edge of a cliff. "Take a seat, Officer Caldwell," Bridget said, her voice even. Dennis hesitated, but then complied, lowering himself into the chair that Samuel had occupied moments earlier. The room felt smaller now, the weight of his actions pressing on him from all sides. Bridget leaned forward, her eyes never leaving Dennis's. "I need you to understand the gravity of what happened today," she began. The pause that followed was brief, but it felt eternal. Samuel Carter is not just another man sitting in the park. He's Special Agent Samuel Carter, one of the most respected members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words hit Dennis like a punch to the gut. His eyes widened as the realization settled in, cold and unforgiving. An FBI agent. He had profiled, questioned, and arrested an FBI agent without cause. The shock coursed through him, making his pulse quicken, each beat hammering at his temples. I didn't know," Dennis stammered, his voice weak, almost childlike in its disbelief. "That's exactly the problem, officer," Bridget said, her tone sharpening. "You acted without knowing, based on an assumption that had no foundation in facts. Do you understand what that means for you? For this department?" Dennis's throat tightened, the initial defiance he clung to now crumbling under the weight of his realization. "I was trying to be vigilant," he murmured, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "Vigilance is essential," Bridget agreed, her eyes narrowing. "But it does not excuse prejudice. It does not excuse acting without evidence." She took a deep breath, leaning back in her chair, but maintaining her sharp gaze. "You detained an innocent man, a federal agent, solely based on your perception. That has consequences, not just for you, but for this entire precinct." Dennis's mind raced as he absorbed her words. The implications unfurled in his thoughts: disciplinary action, the potential for a lawsuit, the trust he'd shattered with his colleagues and the public. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly pallor. He had thought himself untouchable, an experienced officer with years of commendable service, but now that experience felt like a flimsy shield against the storm he had summoned. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice subdued. Bridget's expression softened, but only slightly. "There will be an internal review. You will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending the investigation. The higher-ups at the Bureau have already been notified, and they are not happy. The incident will be documented and scrutinized, and, depending on the findings, it could lead to your suspension or termination." The room fell silent once more, only the ticking of the wall clock filling the void. Dennis felt his hands tremble slightly, a reaction he couldn't suppress. He had spent over 2 decades as an officer, carving out a reputation for being steadfast, reliable. Yet in one moment of misjudgment, all of that stood to be wiped away. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Dennis whispered, more to himself than to Bridget. The reality of what he had done gnawed at him. His career, built on years of discipline and service, now teetered on the brink of collapse because of a choice he made without thinking. Bridget's gaze remained steady, though a touch of weariness seeped into her eyes. "Intention does not erase the impact of your actions, Caldwell. You may not have intended harm, but that doesn't change the harm done." Samuel Carter was detained, questioned, and humiliated in front of the public, all because you failed to see beyond a stereotype. The words stung, each one driving home a truth Dennis could no longer deny. He looked down at his hands, which had guided him through countless routine stops and arrests. Today, they had betrayed him, acting on a reflex that revealed a flaw he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "Captain, is there any way to make this right?" Dennis's voice cracked, the question hanging in the air, fragile and desperate. Bridget's eyes softened a fraction, but her voice remained firm. "There's always a way forward, but it starts with accountability. You need to reflect on why you made the choices you did and what led you there. This precinct can't afford to have officers who let their biases lead them. We are supposed to be better than that." Dennis swallowed hard, nodding slightly as he processed her words. A knock at the door interrupted the moment, and Officer Jenkins peeked in, his expression cautious. "Captain, Special Agent Carter is requesting a word before he leaves." Bridget glanced at Dennis, who sank further into his chair, the weight of the moment threatening to crush him. She nodded at Jenkins. "Send him in." The door opened, and Samuel Carter stepped inside, his posture relaxed but eyes sharp. He looked at Dennis briefly, the silence heavy with unspoken understanding, before turning to Bridget. "Captain, I appreciate your handling of this matter," Samuel said, his tone courteous but tinged with the steel of experience. He paused, looking back at Dennis, whose eyes were fixed on the floor. "Officer Caldwell, we all make mistakes. What matters is what you do after." Dennis lifted his eyes to meet Samuel's, a mix of shame and gratitude flickering in his expression. Samuel's gaze was steady, not accusatory but resolute, a reminder that while consequences were inevitable, growth was a choice. Bridget nodded, a hint of hope stirring beneath the formality of her demeanor. "This isn't over, Officer Caldwell, but it could be the start of something better." The room fell into silence as Samuel turned to leave, his presence a reminder that accountability was the first step toward change. As the door clicked shut behind him, Dennis took a deep breath, the gravity of the road ahead settling firmly on his shoulders. The conference room was stark, with gray walls and a long table surrounded by chairs that bore the weight of countless tense discussions over the years. Today was no exception. Officer Dennis Caldwell sat at one end, his uniform crisp but his demeanor taut, eyes flicking nervously around the room. The murmured conversations of a few officers, present as witnesses and reviewers, filled the air with a low hum. Captain Laura Bridget entered the room last, her presence silencing the murmurs. Behind her, Samuel Carter followed, his composed expression betraying nothing of the day's tension. Dressed in a suit, he stood out among the officers, his bearing that of someone accustomed to command, but equally used to remaining an outsider. He took a seat across from Dennis, their eyes meeting for a split second before Dennis looked away. "Let's begin," Captain Bridget said, settling at the head of the table. The officers around the table straightened, pens poised to document every word. This internal review will examine the actions taken by Officer Caldwell during the detainment of Special Agent Samuel Carter. We are here not just to assess the facts, but to acknowledge what led us to this point and what needs to change. Dennis's throat tightened as he felt every gaze in the room shift toward him. His hands, now clasped together on the table, trembled slightly. The silence was broken by the sound of Captain Bridget flipping open a file. "Officer Caldwell," she began, her voice steady. "In your report, you cited suspicious behavior as the reason for approaching and detaining Special Agent Carter. Would you care to elaborate on what, specifically, was suspicious?" Dennis licked his lips, the dryness in his mouth, making it hard to speak. He matched the general description of a suspect. "Captain," he said, each word carefully measured. "Tall, dark-skinned, sitting alone. When I asked for ID, he was evasive." Samuel's eyebrow lifted slightly, the only indication of his reaction. He waited patiently, exuding an air of quiet control that commanded attention without demanding it. Captain Bridget nodded, but did not soften her gaze. "And at any point, did Mr. Carter act in a way that suggested he was dangerous or attempting to flee?" "No, Captain," Dennis admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing tighter, as if demanding an honest answer he'd resisted giving himself. "Agent Carter," Bridget said, turning her attention to Samuel, "would you like to share your perspective on the encounter?" Samuel inclined his head, his voice calm and firm. "Thank you, Captain. From my view, I was sitting in the park, minding my own business. Officer Caldwell approached me with assumptions rooted in nothing more than my appearance. This was not an isolated incident, but a reflection of biases that go unaddressed and unchecked." The room shifted uneasily. Some officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of discomfort and contemplation. Samuel's words cut to the heart of a matter that many prefer to sidestep: the inherent biases that seep into actions, even those taken under the guise of protocol. Captain Bridget's face remained impassive, but her eyes held a flicker of acknowledgement. She addressed the room. This review is not only about one mistake. It is about the culture that allows such mistakes to happen without reflection or consequence. We are here to change that. Dennis felt exposed, as if the room's fluorescent lights were a spotlight aimed solely at him. He struggled to maintain eye contact with Bridget, let alone with Samuel, whose calm presence seemed almost otherworldly in its composure. One of the senior officers cleared his throat. Officer Caldwell, in hindsight, do you believe your actions were influenced by assumptions not rooted in evidence? The question landed like a blow, one that Dennis had been avoiding since the moment he stepped into the precinct that day. His heart thudded as he opened his mouth, hesitating before he spoke. Yes, he admitted, the single word carrying the weight of his career. I let my assumptions guide me. A murmur rippled through the room, officers shifting in their seats as they processed the admission. Samuel's gaze never wavered, watching Dennis with an expression that was neither pitying nor condemning, but thoughtful. Captain Bridget nodded slowly, her voice softer now, but no less resolute. Acknowledging bias is the first step, but it's not the end. Officer Caldwell, what we do next defines who we are as individuals and as a department. Dennis exhaled shakily, the tightness in his chest easing just enough for him to find his voice. I know, Captain. I want to be better. I need to be better. Samuel's voice cut through the tense silence. We all have work to do, Officer Caldwell. The issue is not whether we have biases. It's what we do when we recognize them. I stand here not just to highlight a wrong, but to push for a change that prevents the next one. The impact of his words lingered, and Captain Bridget allowed the silence to stretch, giving everyone a moment to absorb them. Thank you, Agent Carter, she said, her voice warm with genuine appreciation. Your insights are invaluable to this process. Samuel gave a slight nod. This is bigger than today. It's about making sure that the next time, someone doesn't have to go through this. The room fell silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence, one steeped in reflection and the uncomfortable acknowledgement of the work that lay ahead. Dennis felt something shift within him, a crack in the facade that had once been unyielding. The realization of his bias and its consequences was raw, but it was a starting point. Captain Bridget closed her file and looked around the table. This review will be the foundation for change. We'll implement new training, deeper reviews, and stricter guidelines. This isn't just for show. It's for the integrity of this department and the community we serve. Dennis looked at Samuel, who met his gaze steadily, a subtle nod passing between them. There was no forgiveness in that moment, but there was a mutual understanding. The real work was just beginning, and it would take more than just words to rebuild trust. The precinct felt different now, as if the walls themselves had shifted to reflect the weight of what had happened. Officer Dennis Caldwell sat at his desk, the papers and files that usually cluttered its surface now neatly stacked, as though the order could make sense of the chaos in his mind. The buzz of conversation from other officers filled the background, but it seemed muffled, distant. His eyes moved mechanically over the familiar space, but it felt foreign to him, an echo of what it once was. Captain Laura Bridget's words from the review replayed in his mind, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. Bias doesn't excuse action, she had said. Those words clung to him like an unwelcome shadow. The letter notifying him of his administrative leave sat on the desk, its edges crisp and sharp against the wood. It represented more than just a pause in his duties. It was a symbol of everything he now had to confront. Dennis exhaled, his shoulders sagging as he reached for the letter. His hand trembled, and he withdrew it quickly, clenching it into a fist. 2 decades in the force, countless hours of patrols, arrests, and paperwork, and here he was, uncertain of his place or his worth. The door to his career had been cracked open, revealing a view he hadn't wanted to see, a version of himself he had ignored for too long. The days following the incident had been harsh. The looks from his colleagues were a mix of sympathy and judgment, whispers trailing him wherever he walked. He had never felt this vulnerable before. Dennis prided himself on being the kind of officer who maintained control, who knew right from wrong, and could act decisively. But now, doubt seeped into every corner of his thoughts. I let my assumptions guide me. His own admission in the review stung more than anything. He had said it to appease the process, to demonstrate awareness, but he knew it was only the surface of a deeper truth. The problem wasn't the one encounter. It was what the encounter revealed about him. He looked up as a few officers passed by, their conversation stopping abruptly as they noticed him. Dennis tried to meet their eyes, to convey that he was still the same officer they had worked with for years. But they turned away, their footsteps quickening. The isolation bit into him, harsher than the disciplinary letter on his desk. The day he handed Samuel Carter the cuffs, he hadn't seen a fellow man. He'd seen a potential threat, defined not by action, but by appearance. Dennis's throat tightened as he relived the look in Samuel's eyes during the review. Composed, understanding, but piercing in its quiet condemnation. Samuel's words had been spoken calmly, without malice, but they had unraveled Dennis's confidence thread by thread. At home, the silence was worse. The walls seemed to echo with his own regrets. His wife, a steadfast supporter through every challenge, now watched him with eyes full of questions she didn't voice. He would catch her glancing at him from across the room, her expression soft but tinged with worry. She didn't ask why he was on leave, didn't push him to speak. But the space between them felt wider now, filled with things left unsaid. Dennis walked to the small mirror near the front door, catching his own reflection. He studied the lines on his face, the wear that years on the force had etched into his features. He looked older, more worn, but the image staring back at him also held an unfamiliar fragility. Who was he really? Was he just another officer who let fear and prejudice speak louder than judgment? The question gnawed at him relentlessly. He thought back to the moments that had shaped him, the values drilled into him during training. Protect, serve, act swiftly. But no one had taught him how to unlearn the biases he hadn't even realized were there. The assumptions he made had been invisible to him, buried beneath a sense of duty that now felt hollow. His phone buzzed on the table, jolting him from his reverie. A message from Captain Bridget lit up the screen. "Dennis, take this time seriously. We all need to confront our choices. I hope you use this time to understand yours." The words were neither warm nor harsh. They were a reminder of what lay ahead. Dennis sat down heavily in the chair by the window, the city lights twinkling outside, their brightness mocking the darkness settling over him. He remembered Samuel's parting words. "What matters is what you do after." They echoed in his mind, a challenge and a lifeline. He wanted to believe that change was possible, that he could rebuild himself into someone who served not just with vigilance, but with fairness. But first, he needed to face the uncomfortable truths he'd avoided for too long. The weight of it felt suffocating, but he knew that inaction would mean letting the worst parts of himself win. Dennis pressed his palms together, leaning forward as if in silent prayer. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, or if the precinct would ever feel like home again. But he did know one thing. He was no longer the same officer who had walked into that park days ago, and he couldn't be that man again. The journey ahead would be painful, marked by self-examination and the breaking down of beliefs he had once thought unshakable. But somewhere in that path, there was a chance for redemption. And as terrifying as it was, Dennis knew he had to take it one step at a time. The precinct hummed with an energy that hadn't been felt in years. Captain Laura Bridget stood in the main hall, clipboard in hand, as officers filtered into the briefing room, their conversations low and cautious. A sense of unease had settled over the department since the review, but today marked the beginning of something new, a shift that would ripple through every officer's daily routine and mindset. Bridget's gaze swept the room, taking in the mix of anticipation and skepticism on the faces around her. The past weeks had been tense, filled with internal discussions and planning sessions that extended late into the night. Now the plan was being set into motion. Beside her stood Samuel Carter, his presence commanding but calm. Dressed in a tailored suit, he exuded the quiet authority of someone who knew what change looked like and the resistance it often met. "Good morning," Bridget began, her voice clear and steady. The murmurs ceased as the room focused on her. "We're here today to talk about reform. What happened recently has been a wake-up call, not just for one officer, but for all of us. It has shown us that vigilance alone isn't enough. Integrity, fairness, and a true understanding of who we serve are essential. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Some officers exchanged glances, a few shifting in their seats. Reform was not a welcome word in a place where routine was often the shield against the unexpected. As part of this new initiative, Bridget continued, we'll be implementing comprehensive training programs focusing on bias awareness, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd, meeting resistance and hesitant nods in equal measure. And to lead this, Special Agent Samuel Carter will be lending his expertise. The announcement landed with a mixture of surprise and tension. Samuel stepped forward, his expression neutral but focused. I know change is difficult, he started, his voice carrying a steady resolve. But it is necessary. I am here not to criticize or judge, but to help ensure that what happened doesn't repeat itself. A murmur rose, this time more pointed. Officer Paul Jenkins, who had witnessed the events firsthand, stood up, clearing his throat. Captain, with all due respect, we've been trained for years. Why do we need to change everything now? One incident shouldn't rewrite our entire approach. Bridget's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, Samuel spoke, his tone firm but calm. This isn't about one incident. It's about what that incident represents, a pattern that many have ignored or been unaware of. I know change feels like admitting fault, but it's really about becoming better for the people we serve. Jenkins hesitated, his jaw tightening as he sat back down. The room was tense, but there was a current of realization threading through the discomfort. Officers who had once dismissed conversations about bias as abstract were now faced with an undeniable reality. The meeting continued, with Bridget outlining the specifics of the training schedule. Weekly workshops would be mandatory, conducted in partnership with experts on cultural competence and psychological safety. There would also be practical exercises focusing on situational awareness and alternative approaches to high-stress encounters. As the meeting wrapped up, Samuel lingered, observing the officers disperse with expressions ranging from acceptance to quiet frustration. Bridget joined him, her expression tired but determined. This is just the beginning, she said softly, her eyes following the last few officers out of the room. Samuel nodded. The hardest part is getting people to see past their own defenses. Change always meets resistance, especially when it challenges how people see themselves. I expected pushback, Bridget said, glancing at Jenkins, who was now in conversation with a few others, his brow furrowed. But I didn't think it would feel this strained. Samuel's gaze softened. Reform isn't just policies and training. It's about reshaping culture, and that takes more than a few meetings. It takes persistence and leadership willing to bear the brunt of the discomfort. Bridget's shoulders straightened, a flicker of doubt giving way to resolve. We'll keep pushing. The stakes are too high to let this fade into routine. In the days that followed, the precinct became a battleground of sorts, not in the physical sense, but in ideology. The training sessions were met with mixed reactions. Some officers approached them with genuine interest, eager to understand and improve. Others attended out of obligation, their skepticism apparent in their crossed arms and guarded expressions. Samuel led many of these workshops, sharing experiences that resonated beyond the statistics and theoretical discussions. He recounted stories, not just of encounters like the one with Dennis Caldwell, but moments where bias had silently altered outcomes, where assumptions had led to escalation that could have been avoided. One afternoon, during a session focused on de-escalation, an older officer named Martinez, known for his gruff demeanor, raised his hand. Look, I've been doing this for 30 years, he said, his voice rough but not dismissive. We're taught to be on guard. You're asking us to put that aside, and that doesn't sit right. Samuel nodded, understanding the sentiment. I'm not asking you to abandon vigilance, he said. I'm asking you to recognize that vigilance and fairness aren't mutually exclusive. Protecting yourself and ensuring the safety of others can go hand in hand with challenging your assumptions. Martinez's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. He sat back, the crease in his brow softening as he considered Samuel's words. The pushback was real, but so were the glimpses of progress. A few weeks into the training, Officer Jenkins approached Samuel in the hallway. "Agent Carter," he started, his tone hesitant, "I wanted to say, I get it now. It's not easy, but I see why it's necessary." Samuel's expression shifted into a small, genuine smile. "That's all anyone can ask, Jenkins. One step at a time." As the precinct slowly adapted, Captain Bridget found herself more hopeful. The department still had a long way to go, but seeds of change were beginning to take root. She knew the real test would be how they responded when the lessons were tested in the field, when old habits tugged at the edges of decision-making. But for now, the precinct was moving forward. One day at a time, one officer at a time, they were starting to become what they always claimed to be, protectors of all without prejudice. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the precinct floor, its golden rays filtering through the blinds and warming the cold tiles. Captain Laura Bridget sat at her desk, the remnants of the day's paperwork spread out before her. The precinct had been busy, as usual, but today carried a different air, a sense of tentative renewal. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said, looking up as Samuel Carter stepped into the office. His presence had become a familiar comfort over the past weeks, a sign that the department was heading in the right direction. "Captain," Samuel greeted, his voice calm as ever. He took a seat across from her, his gaze steady but reflective. "I wanted to discuss the progress and what comes next." Bridget nodded, setting her pen down. "We've made strides, but we both know this is only the beginning. The training sessions are laying the groundwork, but real change won't happen overnight." Samuel's eyes softened with understanding. "True change happens in moments of choice," he said. "When an officer is faced with that split-second decision and chooses differently because they've learned to pause and see the whole picture." Bridget exhaled, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. "And you believe we're on that path?" "I do," Samuel replied. "There's resistance, sure, but there's also acknowledgement. I've seen it in how some officers engage, how they listen even when it's uncomfortable. The seeds are there." A shadow crossed the glass-paneled door, and both turned to see Officer Dennis Caldwell standing just outside. His face was lined with tension, eyes downcast as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Bridget's expression turned solemn. "Come in, Officer Caldwell," she called out, her voice measured but not unkind. Dennis stepped in, holding a cardboard box filled with the last of his belongings, framed commendations, a worn coffee mug, a few personal items that had once made his desk feel like home. He glanced between Bridget and Samuel, the silence stretching as he struggled to find words. "I came to collect my things," Dennis said finally, his voice low, almost resigned. His eyes met Bridget's, searching for some sign of forgiveness or final judgment, but found only professionalism. He turned to Samuel, clearing his throat. "Agent Carter, I need to say I'm sorry for what happened, for the assumptions I made. I see it now, clearer than I ever have." Samuel stood, moving a step closer, his gaze steady but not harsh. "Acknowledging it is the first step, Dennis," he said, using the officer's first name intentionally, breaking down the barriers of formality. "What matters is what you choose to do with that understanding." Dennis's shoulders sagged, a mixture of relief and regret playing across his features. "I don't know where to start," he admitted. The confession, vulnerable and raw, filled the room with a tension different from before, one born of hope and uncertainty. Captain Bridget spoke, her voice softening. "We all have moments where we're forced to confront ourselves, Dennis. It's what comes after that defines us. If you're willing, there's a path forward, but it won't be easy." Dennis looked at her, then at Samuel, a flicker of something, determination, perhaps, igniting in his eyes. "I am willing," he said. "I want to learn to be better." Samuel nodded, the tension in his posture easing. "Then start by listening, by questioning what you've always accepted without thought. It's uncomfortable, but it's the only way forward." The silence that followed was heavy, but not oppressive. It felt like the moment before a storm breaks, charged with anticipation, but laced with the promise of clear skies beyond. Dennis took a breath, set down the box on the chair, and straightened his back. "I'll do that," he said, a slight tremor in his voice, but conviction nonetheless. Bridget exchanged a glance with Samuel, a subtle acknowledgement passing between them. "This department is committed to more than just words," she said, looking at Dennis and then around the room as if addressing the precinct itself. "We're building a new culture, one where every officer takes responsibility not just for their actions, but for the mindset behind those actions." Dennis gave a small, grateful nod before turning to leave. As he walked out, the box in hand, the hallway seemed brighter, less daunting than before. Officers watched him pass, some with curiosity, others with cautious respect. Change was palpable, even if it was only in the smallest of gestures. Samuel turned back to Bridget, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "Moments like that are why this matters," he said. "Change starts with one choice, one person deciding to see things differently." Bridget leaned back in her chair, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I just hope that when the next test comes, we're ready." "We will be," Samuel assured, "because the ones who understand now will lead when it counts most." The precinct was quieter as the day wound down, the sun slipping behind the city skyline and casting long shadows across the floor. But within those shadows, the glimmer of change shone through, fragile but resilient. Officers moved with purpose, their conversations subdued but thoughtful. Jenkins, once skeptical, now leaned over a report with Martinez, discussing the latest de-escalation techniques learned from the training. Others paused to greet Samuel with a nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of respect. Bridget watched it all from her office, the scene a testament to the hard road ahead, but also a reminder of what had already been achieved. Samuel stepped toward the door, pausing before leaving. "Thank you for seeing this through, Captain. It's not easy being the one to push for change." Bridget's smile was small but genuine. "Thank you, Samuel. We couldn't have done this without you." As he left, the room felt lighter, the path ahead still uncertain but illuminated by resolve. The precinct had begun to change, not just in policy, but in heart. And as the night settled over the city, it carried the promise that tomorrow would be a step forward, no matter how small. The precinct doors opened, and Samuel Carter stepped out into the fading evening light. The air was cool, carrying the subtle scent of rain that promised to wash the city clean overnight. He paused at the top of the stone steps, his eyes scanning the familiar streets alive with the sound of rushing cars and distant voices. The last few weeks had been transformative, not just for the precinct, but for Samuel himself. He had come here as a man demanding change, and he was leaving with the conviction that real change was, indeed, possible. The events of the past weeks replayed in his mind. Each tense meeting, each moment of resistance and breakthrough. He thought of Officer Dennis Caldwell, the hesitation in his voice as he admitted his fault, and the glimmer of determination in his eyes as he vowed to do better. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Samuel knew, were the hardest part. He took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. The precinct had been a symbol of authority and order, but it had also been a battleground for something deeper. Fairness, justice, and the dismantling of assumptions that had stood unchecked for too long. Samuel felt the weight of it all pressing on him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of why he fought, why he continued to stand up against an unyielding system. The victories weren't always clear or immediate, but they were there, in conversations shifted, in new questions asked, and in the acknowledgement of biases once ignored. Samuel's gaze drifted to the windows of the precinct, where a few officers lingered. Some met his eyes with nods, gestures of respect that had grown over the past few weeks. Others turned away, still grappling with the new reality that Samuel's presence had enforced. It would take time, and not everyone would change overnight. But the seeds had been planted. The soft click of the door opening behind him made Samuel turn. Captain Laura Bridget stepped out, the glow of the streetlights casting a warm hue on her face. She stopped beside him, folding her arms as they both looked out over the street. "It feels different, doesn't it?" Bridget said, her voice low but strong. "It does," Samuel replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Not perfect, but different. Bridget nodded, the weight of the last few weeks evident in the lines around her eyes. Thank you for your part in this. We needed someone to show us what we were missing. Samuel glanced at her, gratitude in his eyes. You were willing to see it. That's more than many would have done. Change only works when it comes from the top, and you made that possible. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in thought. The city seemed to exhale around them, the hum of life steady and familiar. What's next for you? Bridget asked, breaking the silence. Samuel's smile widened, touched with a resolve that burned deep. This was just one precinct. There are countless others where these conversations need to happen, where people need to be heard, and where justice needs to be redefined. Bridget's eyes reflected understanding, an acknowledgement of the journey that lay ahead for both of them. We'll keep working here. It won't be easy, but we'll do it. Samuel nodded, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. That's all that matters, Captain. One step at a time. He turned to descend the steps, the sound of his footsteps echoing softly. The path was never straightforward, and there would be more resistance, more setbacks. But for every step backward, there would be another forward, driven by people who refused to accept the status quo. As he reached the street, Samuel looked up at the city skyline, the lights shimmering against the deepening night. It was a reminder that even in darkness, there was light, small, unwavering, and resilient. It was a new beginning, not just for him, but for everyone who believed that justice was worth the struggle. With renewed determination, Samuel walked into the night, ready to continue his fight for a fairer system, knowing that change was not a moment, but a series of choices. And as long as there were those willing to make those choices, there was hope.